A routine traffic stop. A corrupt police force. A system built to protect turned into a weapon. Maya Carter was driving home when two officers pulled her over without cause. Moments later, she was in handcuffs framed for a crime she didn't commit. But what they didn't know, they had just arrested the wrong woman. Because Maya wasn't just another victim. She was the daughter of a powerful civil rights attorney. And she wasn't going down without a fight. As the city erupts in protest and the truth begins to unravel, the corrupt realize too late they're the ones being hunted now. But can justice truly be served in a system designed to protect the guilty? Stay until the end to see how it all unfolds, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that expose the truth. The night air was thick with humidity, the scent of asphalt and distant rain lingering in the atmosphere. Maya Carter kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel as she slowed her black Mercedes to a stop. Behind her, flashing red and blue lights reflected against the tinted windows of nearby buildings. She took a deep breath. Stay calm. Stay in control. Through the rearview mirror, she saw two white police officers approaching. The older one, Officer Rick Coleman, had a cocky stride, his uniform slightly unbuttoned at the collar. His younger partner, Officer Tom Reeves, walked cautiously, hand resting on his holster. Maya rolled down her window just as Rick leaned in, shining his flashlight directly into her face. His lips curled into a smirk. License and registration, he ordered. Maya's fingers moved smoothly as she retrieved her documents from the glove compartment. She had done nothing wrong. No speeding. No broken taillights. No reason for this stop. May I ask why I'm being pulled over? Her voice was steady, but her pulse drummed against her ribs. Rick let out a chuckle, tilting his head. Oh, come on. A car like this? At this hour? In this neighborhood? Clicked his tongue. Looks suspicious to me. Maya clenched her jaw, but said nothing. She had seen this playbook before. Meanwhile, Tom circled around the car, shining his flashlight inside. He stopped at the back seat, squinting as if he'd spotted something. Rick, Tom called out. You might want to see this. Maya turned, just in time to see Tom reach into the back seat and pull out a small plastic bag filled with white powder. What? Tom whistled, holding the bag up to the light. Well, look what we have here. Maya felt her entire body stiffen. This isn't happening. You planted that, she said firmly, meeting Tom's gaze. Rick smirked. Oh, that's cute. You think we'd risk our careers just to set someone like you up? Maya's eyes flicked to the dashcam mounted on their patrol car. There was her proof. I'd like to request that footage be reviewed. Rick exhaled dramatically, turning to Tom with an exaggerated shrug. You hear that, partner? She wants to see the footage. Tom tapped the dashcam. Damn thing's been acting up all night. No footage, I'm afraid. Of course. Maya's fingers curled into a fist. She could fight this. She had to fight this. Step out of the vehicle, Rick commanded, his hand moving toward his cuffs. Maya didn't move. I have rights. Rick's smirk vanished. You have the right to comply, he snapped. Before she could react, Tom reached for the car door and yanked it open. His grip was rough as he grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back. Cold steel clamped around her wrists. You have the right to remain silent, Rick sneered, shoving her toward the squad car. But between us, it won't help. Maya stumbled, catching herself before she hit the pavement. The weight of the cuffs dug into her skin. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. As she was thrown into the back seat, her heart pounded with fury. The world outside blurred as the squad car pulled away. She refused to let them see her fear. Instead, she smiled. Rick caught the expression through the mirror, and for the first time that night, his smirk faltered. Maya leaned forward, her voice calm. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Rick scoffed, turning back toward the road. He had no idea how right she was. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom buzzed faintly, casting a cold glow over the wooden benches and polished floors. Maya Carter sat at the defendant's table, her hands resting on the surface, wrists still red from the tight cuffs of the previous night. She glanced around the room, her dark brown eyes scanning the faces in attendance. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man named Peter Lawson, straightened his tie and cleared his throat. His reputation preceded him, a state attorney who had never lost a case against a black defendant. Maya knew the odds were stacked against her the moment she walked through the doors. At the back of the room, Rick and Tom sat confidently, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. Maya could still hear Rick's mocking voice from the night before. "Between us, it won't help." Now, she was beginning to understand what he meant. The judge entered, a tall, silver-haired man with sharp eyes and a demeanor that radiated authority. As he settled into his chair, he barely looked at Maya before opening the case file. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice cold and impersonal, "you stand accused of possession of illegal substances with intent to distribute. How do you plead?" Maya sat up straight. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Lawson stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, the evidence against Ms. Carter is overwhelming. A bag of cocaine was found in her vehicle during a routine traffic stop. Officers Coleman and Reeves, both decorated law enforcement officials, conducted a lawful search and discovered the illegal substances. There is no doubt about her guilt." Maya's public defender, a tired-looking man named Alan Green, barely stirred. She had met him for the first time only an hour before the trial. He had flipped through her case file as if he were reading a breakfast menu. "Your Honor," Maya spoke up before Green could, "the officers had no probable cause to stop my vehicle. The drugs were planted. There is no forensic evidence linking me to the bag. Furthermore, I requested dashcam footage, but conveniently, their camera was malfunctioning." The judge barely reacted. His gaze was fixed on her, unreadable. Lawson smirked. "Ms. Carter, are you accusing two sworn officers of perjury and conspiracy?" Maya met his gaze. "Yes." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Rick and Tom exchanged amused glances. Lawson shook his head. "These baseless accusations do not change the fact that drugs were found in your vehicle. We cannot allow individuals like Miss Carter to poison our communities." Maya clenched her jaw. "Individuals like me?" She felt the weight of his words, the coded language wrapped in false civility. Judge Whitmore leaned back, tapping his fingers on the desk. "The word of two officers against yours, Ms. Carter. Without solid proof of misconduct, the court has no reason to doubt their testimony." Maya inhaled deeply. She could feel the walls closing in, suffocating her under the weight of a system designed to convict, not protect. Her attorney finally spoke. "Your Honor, given the lack of dashcam footage, I request leniency." Maya cut him off. "I request justice, not leniency." Whitmore's gaze sharpened. Silence filled the room. "Ms. Carter," the judge said finally, his voice devoid of emotion, "I hereby sentence you to 5 years in state prison." The words struck like a sledgehammer, but Maya refused to let them see her break. No reaction. No tears. The gavel slammed. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. In the gallery, a few activists exchanged uneasy glances, but most people remained silent, accustomed to these rulings. Rick and Tom stood, their faces smug with victory. Rick winked at her as she was escorted away. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as journalists rushed to cover the story. A few civil rights advocates were gathered, holding signs, their faces tight with restrained anger. "Another black life thrown away," someone shouted. Maya was led through the sea of flashing lights, ignoring the microphones shoved in her direction. She had nothing to say yet, but as she was placed into the back of the transport van, her expression remained eerily calm. A black SUV sat across the street, engine idling. Inside, a man in a dark suit watched through tinted windows. He lifted his phone and spoke quietly. "Bury them." Across the city, computers hummed to life. Files were accessed. Bank accounts were frozen. Secrets long thought safe began to unravel. Rick and Tom weren't just dirty cops. They were part of something bigger, and they had just stepped into the wrong game. Maya sat in the back of the transport van, her wrists still bound in cold steel. The vibrations of the road hummed beneath her as the city lights blurred through the reinforced windows. A lesser person might have let the weight of injustice sink them into despair. But Maya Carter was not a lesser person. The trial had been a performance, a carefully orchestrated spectacle where the outcome had been decided before she even stepped into the courtroom. The judge, the prosecutor, the system, they all played their parts. But so had she. She glanced down at her wrists, the faint marks from the handcuffs a reminder of what she had just lost. 5 years. That's what they had sentenced her to. But they didn't know that 5 years was a sentence she had no intention of serving. As the transport van turned a sharp corner, Maya caught sight of a black SUV trailing them from a distance. It had been parked outside the courthouse earlier, watching. The windows were tinted, the figure inside obscured. But Maya knew. Whoever was in that car wasn't just a bystander. A plan was already in motion. Across the city, inside a dimly lit office on the top floor of a glass skyscraper, Richard Carter pressed his hands together, his face carved from stone. Screens flickered before him, displaying bank statements, transaction logs, classified police files. The walls of secrecy surrounding the police department were beginning to crack. "How bad is it?" he asked, voice low. A man in a sleek black suit leaned forward. "Bad enough that if this goes public, the entire department will burn." Richard exhaled through his nose. They had done this to his daughter. The system he had spent his career fighting against had finally come for his own blood. "Then we burn it down," he said simply. The man in the suit, Anthony Wells, an investigative journalist with deep government ties, nodded. "The officers who arrested her, Rick Coleman and Tom Reeves, are involved in dozens of fabricated drug cases. The same playbook over and over. Stopping black drivers, planting evidence, making arrests, and padding their records." Richard's fingers curled into a fist. "And the judge?" Wells smirked. "Let's just say his campaign donations weren't exactly coming from charity organizations." Richard leaned back. Corruption, lies, manipulation. None of it surprised him. But now it was personal. He turned to his assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Valerie Monroe. "Have the documents ready by morning. I want the mayor, the governor, and the Department of Justice to have a copy before sunrise." Valerie nodded. "And the press?" Richard's gaze darkened. "We let them tear this department apart." Meanwhile, at the local police precinct, Rick Coleman poured himself a cup of coffee, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. "Did you see the way she looked at me?" Rick chuckled, shaking his head as he took a sip. "Like she actually thought she had a chance." Tom Reeves leaned back in his chair, kicking his feet up on the desk. "Yeah? Well, people like her always think they're special. But at the end of the day, the system works just fine." Rick grinned. 5 years. She'll be out in 3 with good behavior. If she's lucky. Tom nodded. But something about Rick's confidence unsettled him. "You ever think one of them might actually fight back?" Rick scoffed. "Fight back? Against what?" "The law. The courts." He leaned forward. "Look, Tom, the reason this works is because they can't win. We own the system. The judges, the prosecutors, even the goddamn jury pools are stacked in our favor." Tom frowned, but said nothing. Then his phone buzzed. At first he ignored it, but the second buzz was followed by a third, then a fourth. A deep sense of unease coiled in his gut as he finally glanced down. His bank account balance, frozen. "What the hell?" he muttered, sitting up. Rick's phone buzzed next. Then the precinct's internal network flickered. Officers glanced at their screens, confusion spreading through the room. One by one, files disappeared. Evidence lockers were suddenly flagged for audits. Case files involving Rick and Tom vanished. Rick turned to his desk, logging into his personal email. The subject line of the newest message sent ice through his veins. "We see you." Attached was a video file. Rick hesitated before clicking play. It was grainy, taken from inside Maya's car. It clearly showed Tom planting the bag of drugs. Rick's breath caught. Tom, who had been reading over his shoulder, went pale. This isn't possible," he whispered. Rick's hands shook as he scrolled down the email. Below the video, a single line of text appeared. "Your sins are no longer secrets. Prepare to pay the price." Rick shot up from his chair, nearly knocking over his coffee. "We need to get ahead of this. We need to." The lights in the precinct flickered. Phone started ringing off the hook. Officers scrambled, checking their systems, their accounts, their lives all unraveling in real time. The game had changed, and Rick Coleman was no longer the one in control. Meanwhile, in the transport van, Maya leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes for the first time since her arrest. She didn't know exactly what was happening outside, but she could feel it. The machine that had tried to destroy her was finally beginning to break. A storm was coming, and Maya Carter was at the center of it. The transport van rumbled down the highway, its heavy tires grinding against the pavement. Maya Carter sat in the back, her wrists still sore from the handcuffs. She had spent the past 24 hours in a cycle of humiliation, anger, and patience. Something was happening. She could feel it in the way the guards exchanged uneasy glances before loading her into the van. She had caught one of them whispering into his radio, his voice just low enough that she couldn't make out the words. The energy had shifted. The system that had buried her so easily was suddenly shaking. She didn't know how, but she knew why. Her father was out there. Richard Carter was a man who built his career dismantling corrupt systems. He wasn't just a defense attorney, he was a warrior. A man who had spent decades turning the very laws meant to suppress people like Maya into weapons against the oppressors. And now, they had given him a personal reason to fight. Maya exhaled slowly and glanced toward the security grate that separated her from the two officers in the front seat. They were silent now, the radio turned down low. The driver, a burly officer with a buzz cut, kept checking the rearview mirror, as if expecting something. Then it happened. A black SUV appeared behind them, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Maya sat up. It was the same SUV she had seen outside the courthouse. It accelerated slightly, closing the distance. The driver of the transport van tensed. "Who the hell is that?" His partner, a younger officer with nervous energy, adjusted his grip on the rifle slung across his chest. "You think it's—" The radio crackled. "This is dispatch status update on prisoner transfer 117. The driver grabbed the mic. "We're en route to state penitentiary, approximately 15 minutes out." No issues before he could finish. The black SUV swerved into their lane, cutting them off. "Jesus." The driver slammed on the brakes. The van skidded, tires screeching as it narrowly avoided a crash. Maya braced herself against the seat, her heart pounding. The SUV came to a stop directly in front of them. Its doors opened simultaneously. Two men in suits stepped out, their expressions calm, unreadable. They weren't police. They weren't here by accident. "Who the hell are they?" the young officer muttered, reaching for his radio. The older officer hesitated. "I don't know, but we're not engaging until we get orders." One of the men raised his hand, motioning for the officers to step out. The driver clenched his jaw. Not happening. Then the radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't dispatch. It was another voice, low and authoritative. "Release the prisoner. Now." The younger officer paled. Who is this?" Silence. Then, the voice repeated, slower this time. "Release the prisoner." A cold chill ran down Maya's spine. Whoever this was, they had enough power to hijack police communications. The officers glanced at each other, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Then bang. The back doors of the van exploded outward, the locks torn apart by a controlled charge. Maya flinched as the doors swung open, revealing the same suited men now standing just outside. One of them climbed into the van, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Carter," he said, extending a hand. "It's time to go." Maya hesitated for only a second before taking it. Meanwhile, at the police precinct, Rick Coleman was experiencing his own nightmare. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls from unknown numbers. Messages flooding his inbox. His financial accounts all frozen. "Something's happening," Tom muttered, pacing the break room. "This is bigger than we thought." Rick slammed his fist against the table. "It's that damn lawyer, Richard Carter. He's behind this." "Yeah," Tom snapped. "And what the hell are we supposed to do about it? We got the entire damn internet coming after us." Rick gritted his teeth. "We control this town. We have the mayor, the judge, the system. You sure about that?" Tom interrupted, holding up his phone. His face was pale. "Because according to this, the FBI just opened a corruption investigation into our entire precinct." Rick froze. "What?" Tom turned the screen toward him. A breaking news alert flashed across the display. "Federal probe into police misconduct launched. Sources say evidence of widespread corruption found." Rick's stomach twisted. This wasn't just bad. This was the end. His mind raced. He needed a way out. Fast. Then another text message came through. No name. No number. Just a single sentence. "Run while you still can." Rick's breath hitched. His hands shook. "Tom," he whispered. "We need to leave. Now." Tom frowned. "What are you talking about?" Rick grabbed his coat. "They're coming for us. We stay here, we're dead." Tom looked around the precinct. Officers whispered to each other in hushed voices. Computers continued wiping files on their own. Tom's voice dropped to a whisper. "Who is they?" Rick didn't answer, because deep down he already knew. And for the first time in his career, he was afraid. Back on the road, Maya sat in the black SUV, finally free. The man sitting across from her pulled out a tablet, showing her something. The news alert. The system that tried to destroy her, it was collapsing. She looked up, her voice calm but firm. "Take me to my father." The man nodded. "He's waiting." Maya turned to the window, watching the city blur past. Rick and Tom had started this, but she was going to finish it. The black SUV sped down the highway, weaving seamlessly between lanes as the city skyline loomed in the distance. Maya Carter sat in the back seat, her wrists finally free, though the faint indentations from the cuffs still lingered on her skin. Beside her, the man who had pulled her from the transport van, tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit, typed effortlessly on his tablet. He hadn't introduced himself, but Maya already knew. Her father had sent him. "Where is he?" she asked, voice steady. The man glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the screen. "Safe." That wasn't an answer. Maya narrowed her eyes. "And Rick Coleman?" "Tom Reeves." A small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Running, I assume?" He turned the tablet toward her. Maya leaned forward, scanning the headlines. She scrolled down. Rick Coleman and Tom Reeves' names were everywhere. Every major news outlet had picked up the story. Reports of falsified arrests, fabricated evidence, and systemic abuse were pouring in. Maya exhaled, her chest tightening. It was happening, but she wanted more. "This isn't enough," she muttered. "They need to pay." The man studied her for a moment, then nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. "Then let's make sure they do." Rick Coleman shoved a duffel bag into the trunk of his car, sweat dripping down his forehead. His hands shook as he zipped it shut. Cash, burner phones, his service weapon, everything he needed to disappear. Tom Reeves stood a few feet away, pacing anxiously. "You think they'll let us walk away from this?" Rick slammed the trunk shut and turned to him. "We don't have a choice, Tom. You saw the news. The feds are coming. If we stay, we're done. Tom wiped a hand down his face. But the department, Rick grabbed him by the collar. Voice a sharp whisper. The department won't save us. They'll sacrifice us to cover their own asses. The judge, the mayor, all of them. We were useful to them until we weren't. Tom swallowed hard. He knew Rick was right. The system only protected its own until it became inconvenient. Rick turned, sliding into the driver's seat. We get to the safe house, lay low, figure out our next move. Tom hesitated before climbing into the passenger seat. And if they find us? Rick started the engine, his jaw clenched. Then we make sure they regret it. The car peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching against the pavement. What they didn't realize was they were already too late. Maya stepped into the spacious penthouse, where her father, Richard Carter, stood at the center of controlled chaos. The air buzzed with movement, investigators, reporters, activists all working together, pulling records, cross-referencing names, and exposing a system built on corruption. Richard turned as she entered, his sharp eyes scanning her face. Then, for the first time in years, his expression softened. Maya, he murmured. She exhaled. Dad. In an instant, she was in his arms. Richard held her tight, as if grounding himself in the reality that she was here, alive and free. But when they pulled apart, his face hardened again. They wanted to destroy you, he said quietly. They thought they could silence us. Maya's eyes darkened. They thought wrong. She turned to the screens, lining the wall, news reports, leaked files, bank records. You got everything? She asked. Valerie Monroe, Richard's top investigator, nodded. Every bribe, every cover-up, every innocent life ruined by those bastards. The DOJ already has enough to shut down half the precinct. But it's not just about them, Richard added. This runs deeper. The mayor, the judge, the entire network that let this happen. Maya's fingers curled into fists. Then let's take them all down. Richard smiled grimly. That's exactly what we're doing. Rick and Tom reached the safe house just before midnight, a rundown cabin on the outskirts of town. The second Rick stepped inside, his phone buzzed. He froze. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Who is this? A voice, smooth and precise, came through the line. You have two options, Rick. Rick's grip tightened on the phone. What the hell is this? You can turn yourselves in, face trial, maybe negotiate a deal. Rick's pulse pounded. And the other option? Silence. Then, the voice continued, calm and deliberate. You run. You disappear. But understand this, you will never stop running. Rick's breath came fast and shallow. He turned, finding Tom's equally panicked expression. Then his phone buzzed again. A video message. Rick clicked on it. It was surveillance footage of his own precinct. The judge, the mayor, top officials, all of them were scrambling. They were turning against him. Rick staggered backward, bile rising in his throat. This isn't possible, he whispered. It's already done, the voice on the phone said. Then, the line went dead. Rick's hands trembled as he turned to Tom. We need to go. Now. But before they could even reach the door, headlights flooded the windows. The sound of dozens of car doors slamming shut. Then a voice over a loudspeaker. Rick Coleman. Tom Reeves. Step outside with your hands in the air. The FBI had arrived. Rick let out a shaky breath. He had spent his career hunting people down. Now, the hunter had become the hunted. As he reached for the door handle, he knew one thing for certain: his time was up. Maya watched the live feed of Rick and Tom being dragged out in handcuffs. The system that had once worked against her? It was burning. She turned to her father. What happens now? Richard clasped a hand on her shoulder. Now we rebuild. We make sure this never happens again. Maya nodded. But deep down, she knew this fight wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The morning air was crisp, but the atmosphere in the city was anything but calm. News vans clogged the streets. Protesters gathered outside the police precinct, their voices rising in chants that echoed through the concrete jungle. The once powerful shield of law enforcement had shattered, and the world was watching as its pieces fell. At the heart of it all, Rick Coleman and Tom Reeves sat in separate interrogation rooms at the FBI field office, the weight of their crimes pressing down on them like a vice. Rick sat at the metal table, wrists cuffed, sweat pooling at the base of his neck. He hadn't spoken a word since his arrest. The once cocky officer, who had spent years abusing his badge, now looked like a cornered animal. A door creaked open. A man in a dark suit entered, setting a file down with a slow, deliberate motion. He took a seat across from Rick and folded his hands. "Rick Coleman," he said, his voice even. "Detective, decorated officer, poster boy for law and order." He leaned forward, flipping open the file. "And now, federal suspect number 1. Rick exhaled through his nose, but said nothing. The agent continued. "The mayor, the judge, even your own precinct chief, they're all cutting deals. Turning on you. The FBI has enough evidence to put you away for the rest of your life." Rick finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I want a lawyer." The agent chuckled, shaking his head. "You think that'll save you?" He slid a piece of paper across the table. "We have a deal for you, Coleman. Names, connections, evidence. You help us take down the real power players, and maybe you won't rot in a cell forever." Rick's jaw clenched. "And if I don't?" The agent shrugged. "Then you go down alone. And considering how many people you've thrown under the bus, I doubt you'll last long in general population." Rick swallowed hard. He knew the truth. The moment he stepped into prison, he wouldn't survive. And for the first time in his life, he was powerless. Maya stood before a wall of monitors, watching the live coverage of Rick and Tom's arrests. They had fallen, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Her father, Richard Carter, entered the room, placing a folder onto the table. "They're crumbling faster than expected. The entire department is in chaos." Maya turned to him. "And the people who let them do this? The ones who let them get away with it for years?" Richard sighed. "That's where things get complicated. The system protects its own. Even with the FBI involved, the higher-ups, the ones who gave the orders, will do everything in their power to walk away untouched." Maya's fingers drummed against the table. "Then we take that power away." She grabbed the folder and flipped through it. Inside were documents, photos, and financial records. The corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. "This isn't just about 2 cops," she murmured. "This is about an entire network. The judge, the mayor, the donors who paid them off." Richard nodded. "And we just found the thread to pull." Maya's eyes flicked toward one name at the top of the list. Mayor David Langston, the man who had stood in front of cameras for years, preaching about justice and equality while quietly funding the very police force that had nearly destroyed her life. "He knew," Maya whispered. "He protected them." Richard sat down. "And now we make sure he doesn't get to do it anymore." Mayor Langston paced behind his desk, his phone pressed tightly against his ear. "What do you mean the feds are in my office?" he snapped. "Who the hell authorized?" A sharp knock at the door cut him off. The door swung open before he could respond, and Maya Carter stepped inside. The mayor's face went pale. Who let you in here?" Maya smirked. "Your security's a little preoccupied with the federal agents raiding your files." Langston's grip on the phone tightened. "This is harassment. You can't just—" "Oh, but we can." Maya stepped closer, dropping a thick folder onto his desk. "This is everything, Mr. Mayor. Every bribe, every backroom deal, every cover-up. You didn't just ignore the corruption in your department. You funded it." Langston's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "You don't have proof of anything." Maya tapped the folder. "Actually, we do. And in about 15 minutes, so will the public." Langston's breath hitched. "You wouldn't?" Maya folded her arms. "Oh, I absolutely would." She leaned in, lowering her voice. You thought this city belonged to you, that people like me would always be too scared to fight back. She smiled coldly. You were wrong. Langston's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen, his face draining of color. The news alerts were already spreading. Maya turned toward the door, pausing only briefly. Enjoy your last moments in power, Mr. Mayor. Your time's up. Then, without another word, she walked out. By nightfall, Mayor Langston had resigned. The police chief followed. The judge who had sentenced Maya was placed under federal investigation. The system that had protected Rick and Tom was collapsing. Maya stood on the rooftop of her father's law firm, looking out at the city lights. You did it, Richard said, joining her. Maya shook her head. We did it. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe. She had been arrested, framed, nearly destroyed. But she had survived. And now, the people who had tried to break her were the ones running for cover. She turned to her father. So what now? Richard smiled. Now we rebuild. Maya looked back at the skyline. The city had been broken, but it wasn't beyond saving. Not yet. And for the first time in a long time, she believed justice was possible. The city was still burning, not with fire, but with consequences. Mayor Langston had resigned in disgrace. The police chief had been forced out. The judge who had sentenced Maya was now the one under federal investigation. The fall of the corrupt was swift, but Maya Carter knew it wasn't over. The system didn't just crumble overnight. It adapted. It survived. And it protected those who still held power. Which was why she wasn't celebrating just yet. Because there was still one loose end. And he was on the run. Rick Coleman's hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. The sky was dark, the empty road stretching endlessly ahead. His car's headlights were the only thing cutting through the pitch-black void. Tom Reeves sat beside him, hunched over, nervously tapping his fingers against the dashboard. He hadn't said a word in the past hour. They had fled as soon as they were released on bail. They knew what was coming. Their precinct had abandoned them. The FBI was after them. The people they once called friends and allies had suddenly forgotten their names. Rick gritted his teeth. He had been untouchable. He had built his career on power, on fear. And now he was just another man on the run. He tightened his grip on the wheel. We lay low for a few weeks. Head south. Mexico, maybe. Get new IDs. Tom swallowed hard. And then what? Spend the rest of our lives hiding. Rick didn't answer, because deep down he already knew the truth. They were never going to outrun this. And then his phone buzzed. Rick glanced down. Unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Who is this? A voice smooth, controlled, and familiar filled the car. Maya Carter says hello. Rick's breath caught. His pulse thundered in his ears. You listen to me, Sho, the voice interrupted. You don't have much time, Rick. So I'd suggest you listen carefully. Rick felt his stomach twist. He knew that voice. Anthony Wells, the journalist turned investigator who had been working with Richard Carter. You got no proof of anything, Rick snapped, trying to keep his voice steady. Wells chuckled. Rick, we don't need proof. You're already guilty. The court of public opinion has decided. You've lost your badge, your power, your protection. And let's be real, you won't last a week in prison. Rick's hands shook harder. Looked at him. What the hell is going on? Rick ignored him. What do you want? You have two choices, Wells said. One, you turn yourself in. Full confession. Give up every dirty cop, every corrupt official you worked for. Maybe they cut you a deal. Rick knew that was a lie. There was no deal waiting for him. Only a cell. He swallowed. And option two? A pause. Then, Wells' voice dropped to a whisper. You keep running, Rick, but you'll never stop looking over your shoulder. Never stop wondering when it's going to happen, because someone will find you. Rick's mouth went dry. You think the people you worked for will protect you? Wells continued. They're the ones who sold you out. The moment you got caught, you became a liability. Rick's heart pounded. So what's it going to be, Coleman? Silence. Then the call ended. Rick stared at the road ahead. It suddenly felt much darker than before. Maya Carter stood on the rooftop of her father's law firm, staring out at the city below. She could still hear the distant chants of protesters, the heartbeat of a movement that refused to die. The people had spoken, and, this time, the system had been forced to listen. Richard Carter stepped up beside her, hands in his pockets. "You did good, Maya." She exhaled. "Not good enough." Richard tilted his head. "We took down the mayor, the police chief, the judge. The corruption in this city will never be the same again." Maya shook her head. "It's not about taking down a few names. It's about making sure they never come back." Richard studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. "You sound like me when I was your age." Maya turned to him. "And you sound like someone who's tired of fighting." Richard chuckled. "Tired? Maybe. But I'm not done yet." He looked at her. "And neither are you." Maya nodded. "No, I'm not. Because as long as people like Rick Coleman existed, this fight wasn't over." Rick Coleman sat on the edge of a cheap motel bed, staring at the phone in his hand. His mind was racing. The walls were closing in. His car was parked outside, packed with everything he owned. He could leave. He could keep running. But Wells' voice echoed in his head. "You'll never stop looking over your shoulder." Rick squeezed his eyes shut. Then, a knock at the door. His breath caught. Slowly, he reached for his gun. His fingers wrapped around the grip as he moved toward the door. Another knock. He swallowed hard, his heartbeat deafening. Then a voice. "Rick." He froze. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the FBI. It was Tom. Rick hesitated before unlocking the door. Tom stepped inside, looking exhausted. His clothes were wrinkled, his face pale. Rick frowned. "What the hell are you doing here?" Tom sighed. "I can't do this anymore." Rick's grip on his gun tightened. "What are you talking about?" Tom's eyes met his. "I turned myself in." Rick's heart stopped. "I told them everything," Tom continued. "Every case. Every lie. Every time we planted evidence." Rick staggered backward. It's over, Rick," Tom said quietly. "There's nowhere left to run." Rick's vision blurred with rage. Tom took a slow step back. "I just came here to tell you whatever happens next, you brought this on yourself." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Rick stood there, completely frozen. For the first time in his life, he had no way out. And deep down he knew he had already lost. Rick Coleman sat in the dimly lit motel room, his gun resting on the nightstand beside him. The clock on the wall ticked, each second stretching into an eternity. Tom Reeves was gone. He had confessed everything. Rick could still hear his former partner's voice echoing in his head. "I turned myself in. It's over, Rick. There's nowhere left to run." Rick clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. There was always a way out. His phone vibrated. A message flashed across the cracked screen. "Unknown number. Final warning. Surrender now." Rick exhaled sharply. They wanted him to break. They wanted him to walk into an interrogation room like some pathetic criminal, spill everything, and beg for mercy. That wasn't going to happen. He grabbed the gun and checked the magazine fully loaded. If they were coming for him, he wouldn't make it easy. Then the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Rick's entire body tensed. He moved to the window, peeling back the curtain just enough to see. A single black SUV had pulled into the parking lot. Two figures stepped out, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. Rick's pulse quickened. He had been a cop long enough to recognize a tail when he saw one. This wasn't the FBI. This was something else. He moved quickly, stuffing the gun into the waistband of his jeans. He grabbed his duffel bag. But before he could take another step, a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Rick's breath caught in his throat. The smart move would be to slip out the back, disappear into the night. But whoever these people were, They had found him once. They would find him again. Another knock. Rick steeled himself. He reached for his gun, clicked off the safety, and then he opened the door. Maya Carter sat in front of a wall of monitors, watching the latest reports. The corruption scandal had reached national headlines. Federal investigation expands as more officials are implicated. Former officers Rick Coleman and Tom Reeves accused of fabricating evidence in over 50 cases. City Hall in crisis following mass resignations. It was happening fast. But one headline caught her eye. Rick Coleman still at large. Authorities in pursuit. Maya leaned forward, her jaw tightening. "He's running," she muttered. Richard Carter, standing nearby, crossed his arms. "He won't get far. The FBI has an arrest warrant out. Every law enforcement agency in the country is looking for him." Maya wasn't convinced. Rick Coleman wasn't the type to go quietly. She glanced at Valerie Monroe, their lead investigator. "Any update on our end?" Valerie adjusted her earpiece. "We intercepted a signal from Coleman's burner phone an hour ago. He's holed up at a motel outside city limits." Maya's heart pounded. "Is he armed?" Valerie nodded. "Most likely." Maya exhaled. This had to end tonight. She looked at her father. "I want to be there when he's taken down." Richard frowned. "That's not a good idea, Maya." "I don't care," she shot back. "This started with me. I need to see it through." Richard hesitated for only a moment, then nodded. "Let's finish this." The air was thick with tension. The only sound was the occasional flickering of a broken neon sign outside the lobby. Maya stepped out of the black SUV, her heels crunching against the gravel. She wore no fear on her face, only resolve. Behind her, Valerie and two federal agents stood ready. They had given Rick a chance to surrender. He hadn't taken it. Now it was time for the last stand. Maya approached the motel door, stopping just short of it. "Rick Coleman," she called out, her voice steady. "It's over." Silence. She continued. "Your friends abandoned you. The system you hid behind won't protect you anymore. You're alone, Rick." Still, no response. Maya took a deep breath, then said the words she knew would cut the deepest. "Tom turned himself in. He gave up everything, including you." For a moment, she thought maybe he wouldn't answer. Then the door creaked open. Rick stood there, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot. He had a gun in his hand, but his grip was loose. Maya held her ground. "What's the plan, Rick? Shoot me? Shoot yourself? Run again?" Rick's jaw clenched. "You think you've won?" Maya took a step forward. "I know I have." Rick laughed bitterly. "You think this changes anything? The system will replace me. Someone else will take my place." Maya didn't blink. "Maybe, but they won't be able to do what you did. Not after this." Rick's hands trembled. His entire life had crumbled in front of him. The badge, the power, the control, it was all gone. For the first time, he was truly afraid. And he hated that she could see it. "You destroyed me," he whispered. Maya shook her head. "No, Rick. You destroyed yourself." A beat of silence. Then Rick took a slow, shuddering breath, and he dropped the gun. The second the weapon hit the floor, the agents moved in. Rick didn't fight, didn't resist. He simply let it happen. As they placed him in cuffs, Maya stepped closer. "You framed me," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "You tried to bury me." Rick looked at her, something hollow in his expression. "But I survived." Maya turned away as the agents led him to the awaiting car. Rick Coleman, the man who had once believed himself untouchable, was finished. Maya stood there for a moment, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the motel windows. Then, slowly, she exhaled. It was finally over. Maya returned to the rooftop of her father's law firm. The city sprawled out beneath her. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe. Richard joined her, hands in his pockets. "How do you feel?" Maya looked at him, then back at the city. Like I finally won? Richard smiled. You did. Maya exhaled, letting the weight of everything settle. She had fought. She had survived. And now she was free. The sun was beginning to rise over the city, casting streaks of orange and gold against the skyline. From the rooftop of Carter Law Firm, Maya Carter stood silently, watching as the world slowly woke up. The morning air was crisp, yet it did little to cool the fire still burning inside her. She had won. Rick Coleman was in custody. Tom Reeves had turned himself in. The police department was in shambles. City Hall was in crisis. And the entire nation had watched as the system that had tried to destroy her collapsed under its own weight. But the victory fell hollow. She had fought tooth and nail to expose the corruption. But at what cost? Maya turned as Richard Carter stepped up beside her, his expression unreadable. He had spent his entire career tearing down unjust systems, but now even he looked tired. You should get some rest, he said quietly. Maya let out a dry chuckle. Rest? After all of this? She shook her head. I don't think I know how to anymore. Richard studied her for a moment before reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. Maya hesitated before unfolding it. It was a list of names, dozens of them. Some she recognized: judges, politicians, business executives. Others were unfamiliar. What is this? She asked. Richard sighed. The people who kept Coleman and Reeves in power. The ones who funded them, protected them, allowed them to operate without consequences for years. Maya frowned. You mean the ones who are still walking free? Richard nodded. Justice isn't just about taking down one or two bad cops, Maya. It's about dismantling the entire machine. And the machine is still running. Maya tightened her grip on the paper. Then we're not finished. Richard placed a firm hand on her shoulder. No, we're not. But I need you to understand something. His gaze was heavy. This isn't a war you can fight forever. Justice always comes at a price. And sometimes... He paused. Sometimes that price is too high. Maya exhaled. She knew what he meant. She had already paid so much: her freedom, her peace, her sense of security. But she wasn't done paying. Not yet. Rick Coleman sat in a cold, gray interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. His once pristine uniform was gone, replaced with a standard orange jumpsuit. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his face. He had barely slept. How could he? His entire world had been ripped apart. The people he thought would protect him had thrown him away the second he became a liability. The system he had once manipulated so easily had turned against him. Now he was just another criminal. The door creaked open, and a federal prosecutor walked in, followed by a stern-looking FBI agent. They took their seats across from him. The prosecutor, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes, placed a thick file on the table. Mr. Coleman, she began, flipping through the pages. We have you on over 50 counts of fabricated evidence, false arrests, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Not to mention the federal corruption charges. She tapped the folder. Even with a plea deal, you're looking at 25 to life. Rick's throat tightened. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He forced a smirk. And what if I start talking? The prosecutor leaned back. That depends on how much you're willing to give us. Rick exhaled. His hands trembled. He could try to fight this. He could stay silent, refuse to cooperate. But deep down he knew the truth. He had nothing left to fight for. Slowly he nodded. I want a deal. The prosecutor exchanged a glance with the FBI agent before nodding. Then start talking. Rick took a deep breath. And then he started naming names. Maya sat at her desk, the list of names still clenched in her hands. She could end this right now. She had enough evidence to expose every last person involved. But then what? She thought about the cost. If she released the files, people would come after her. Powerful people. The same ones who had protected men like Rick Coleman for years. She had already been framed once. She had already been dragged through the system. Could she survive it again? A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Valerie Monroe stepped in, holding a USB drive between her fingers. "It's done," she said. Maya blinked. "What?" Valerie smirked. Rick Coleman cracked. He gave up everything. Names, bank accounts, secret meetings. The DOJ has enough evidence to take down everyone on that list. She tossed the USB onto the desk. "We won." Maya stared at the small device. It felt too easy. "What's wrong?" Valerie asked, noticing the hesitation in her expression. Maya exhaled. "Nothing. It's just after everything we've been through, I didn't think it would end like this." Valerie chuckled. "It doesn't. Not really. There will always be another case, another fight. But for now?" She patted Maya's shoulder. "For now we rest." Maya nodded, though she wasn't sure she knew how to anymore. But as she looked down at the list of names, the names of the people who had built the system that nearly destroyed her, she knew one thing for certain. Justice had been served. And this time it was the corrupt who had paid the price. The city had changed. Protests turned into celebrations. The police department was under federal oversight. The streets that once felt hostile were now filled with hope. Maya stood outside Carter Law Firm, looking up at the skyline. She had spent her entire life fighting for justice. And now, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had actually won. Her father stepped beside her. "You did good, Maya." She smiled. "We did good." Richard nodded. "So what now?" Maya took a deep breath. "Now." She looked out at the city, her city. "Now we make sure this never happens again." And with that, she turned and walked back inside. Because the fight for justice never truly ends. Maya Carter had never felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, the tension that had wrapped around her chest like a vice had begun to loosen. The weight of injustice, the suffocating grip of a broken system, it was still there, but now she could breathe. Because this time they had won. The corruption that had tried to swallow her whole had been exposed, dismantled, and brought to its knees. Rick Coleman and Tom Reeves were facing federal charges. Their former allies had abandoned them. And the entire city had seen firsthand what happened when people refused to stay silent. The Carter name had always been a symbol of justice. But now it was a symbol of victory. The air was thick with anticipation. Every seat in the courtroom was filled with journalists, activists, legal experts. The people who had watched this case unfold from the shadows now sat front and center, waiting for the final blow. Maya sat in the gallery, her father beside her. She had been here before in this very room, when the system had tried to bury her. But now, she was here to watch it hold the guilty accountable. Rick Coleman sat at the defendant's table, his face gaunt, his once smug expression now replaced with something hollow. He had lost everything. His plea deal had fallen through. The federal prosecutors had decided that no amount of cooperation could erase the damage he had done. Today was his sentencing. The judge, a different one this time, one who hadn't been bought and paid for, adjusted his glasses and looked down at Rick. "Mr. Coleman," he said, his voice steady, "you abused your position as an officer of the law. You violated the rights of innocent people. You planted evidence, destroyed lives, and acted without remorse." Rick didn't lift his head. The judge continued, "This court finds you guilty on all counts. You are hereby sentenced to 40 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." A hush fell over the room. Then, a ripple of emotion, relief, triumph, justice. Maya let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was over. Really over. Rick had once been the untouchable predator of the system. Now, he was its prey. As he was led out in cuffs, he finally looked at Maya. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply met his gaze and said nothing, because his fate spoke for itself. In the weeks following the trial, the city transformed. The police department was under full federal oversight. Dozens of officers were indicted. The old guard, the ones who had turned a blind eye, were forced out. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to walk the streets at night. Maya Carter had spent her whole life fighting the system. And now, for the first time, it felt like the system was actually changing. But she also knew the truth. One victory didn't mean the war was won. She had taken down the corrupt. But corruption would always try to return. And she would always be ready to fight it. Maya sat across from her father in his office, the city skyline stretching behind them. Richard Carter leaned back, watching her carefully. "It's been a long road, hasn't it?" Maya nodded. "And it's not over." Richard smirked. "It never is." She exhaled. "I thought winning would feel different." "It never feels the way you expect it to," Richard admitted. "Justice is slow. Change is slower. But what we did here, it mattered." Maya glanced down at a stack of case files on the desk. New cases. New people who needed help. The work never stopped. "Are you ready to take on the next fight?" Richard asked. Maya didn't hesitate. "Always." A week later, Maya stood on a stage in front of a packed auditorium. The city had invited her to speak, a symbol of the fight for justice, a survivor who had refused to be silenced. She stepped up to the microphone, took a breath, and looked out at the sea of faces. She could see them, the ones who had lost loved ones to the system, the ones who had been wrongfully accused, the ones who had once felt as helpless as she had. Maya Carter was living proof that the system could be challenged, that corruption could be defeated. She gripped the microphone and began. "This city tried to break me," she said, her voice strong. "But it failed." A wave of applause. "Rick Coleman thought he could take my freedom, but I took his." More applause. "But this fight wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. Every single person who has ever been ignored, oppressed, or silenced by a system built to control, rather than protect." Silence. A deep, listening silence. Maya's voice softened. "The world is watching. They want to see if we'll let this victory fade away." She looked out at them, eyes blazing. "We won't." And as the crowd erupted in cheers, Maya Carter knew this was just the beginning. Because justice wasn't a moment. It was a movement, and she wasn't going anywhere. Justice isn't just a fight, it's a movement. And this story proves that no one is above the law. But the battle against corruption doesn't stop here. It happens every day, in every city, in every country. What do you think about Maya's journey? Have you ever seen injustice like this where you live? Let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And if you want more powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Together, we make sure justice always wins.